Ma Ying-jeou apparently made the point that, during his time in office, things were quiet across the strait.
Yeah, he contrasted that with all the encirclement exercises we're seeing now. But the analysis we read raised a pretty sharp question.
Which is?
Well, why point the finger at the current government in Taiwan? Shouldn't the focus be on, the entity actually doing the exercises?
Right. The piece used that analogy, didn't it?
It did. It was like blaming a bank for having cash after it gets robbed.
Instead of blaming the robber?
Nice.
So that certainly puts a different spin on where the criticism should lie.
Definitely. And this ties into the second big point, how much the world itself has changed.
Okay, how so?
Well, Ma's presidency was during a peak globalization phase, wasn't it? Lots of countries were engaging with China, cooperating.
Right, and the analysis suggested that wasn't just down to his policies alone. It was sort of a global wave at the time.
Precisely. But now we're in a very different scenario. People are talking about a new Cold War, basically U.S.-China confrontation.
And Taiwan's caught in the middle, with maybe less room to maneuver independently on that big stage.
Exactly. And the analysis raises a serious concern here that using the old playbook, the ideas from that cooperation era, might be actively harmful today.
Harmful how?
The argument is it could push Taiwan too close to China, get it frozen out internationally, and potentially even lead to it becoming part of the PRC. The text described that outcome pretty bluntly as a catastrophe.
Wow. Okay, so the criticism is that Ma's statements don't really account for this massive shift in the global context. Makes them seem, irresponsible according to this view.
That's the core argument, yes. Which kind of leads us to the next point, these anti-dictatorship claims popping up in Taiwan.
Right. Protests are, normal in a democracy like Taiwan. But this analysis questioned the specific slogan being used, something like anti-green communist war dictatorship.
Yeah, it seemed a bit strong. The analysis pushes back by pointing out the actual political situation.
Like the fact that the opposition party isn't exactly powerless.
Not at all. They control multiple cities and counties. They hold a majority in the legislature.
And people can clearly assemble and speak out. There are protests.
Exactly. The point being made is, would a real dictatorship tolerate that level of open opposition and public criticism? It seems unlikely.
So it challenges the very label of dictatorship in this context.
Pretty directly, yes. And then finally, there was the TSMC issue. Ma Ying-jeou's comment about Lai Ching-te giving TSMC to the United States.
That sounds like a headline grabber. But the analysis suggests it's maybe not that simple.
Yeah, it calls it an oversimplification, even a distortion. The perspective offered is that TSMC deciding to build factories in the U.S. is likely based on multiple factors.
Like what? Business reasons.
Primarily, yeah. Things like diversifying investments, managing risks. Standard practice for a huge global company. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, essentially.
Right. Not necessarily some grand political giveaway, but more about complex corporate strategy in a changing world.
That's the alternative view presented. It fits with the bigger theme of understanding decisions within their broader economic and geopolitical context.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. We're jumping straight into some really fascinating stuff happening over in Taiwan in 2025. They're calling it the Great Recall. Sounds pretty big, right?
It really is. Based on what we're seeing, this isn't just, one or two things. It's a huge wave of efforts trying to remove elected officials. We're talking national legislators, even a city mayor, local councilors too. It's happening at basically all levels.
Okay, great recall. So what's the story here? What kicked this all off?
Well, it seems like the main trigger was the 2024 legislative elections. The results, they really shifted the power dynamic. The Kuomintang, the KMT, and the Taiwan People's Party, the DPP, they ended up with a majority in the national legislature. And that left the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, which had been the ruling party, they became the minority.
Okay. The classic smaller government, larger opposition situation. We see that play out sometimes. So what happened then with this new setup?
Exactly. It's called Yujin in Mandarin. Literally, the court is small, the opposition is large, and it created real problems. Passing new policies became really difficult, and the opposition parties, the KMT and TPP, they managed to make some pretty substantial cuts to the central government's budget.
Substantial cuts? How much are we talking?
We're talking over 200 billion NT dollars cut. It's reportedly way more than usual, like 6 times the typical cut. That kind of money affects real things, infrastructure, social programs.
Whoa. Yeah, that's definitely going to cause some waves. So how did the DPP, the party in power nationally but minority in the legislature, how did they react?
They weren't happy, as you'd expect. The DPP and also several civic groups, they started pushing back. They called for recalling a number of KMT legislators. Their argument was basically that the KMT and TPP were creating legislative chaos, pushing through controversial bills without enough discussion.
Legislative chaos. Okay. What kind of bills? What were the main points of contention?
There were a few key ones that really fueled the fire. First, these National Assembly reform or expansion of power bills. These apparently gave the legislature more power to investigate the government, more, say, in presidential stuff. The DPP saw this as a massive overreach, infringing on the powers of the executive and judicial branches, upsetting the whole balance. That's a big deal in their system.
Right, the legislature potentially grabbing too much power. What else?
Then there are actions described as trying to paralyze the Constitutional Court, changing rules around interpreting the Constitution, confirming judges. The court is supposed to check if laws are constitutional, so weakening it is seen as a serious threat to the rule of law.
Right, it sounds serious.
Plus, changes to the election and recall laws themselves. The DPP argued these made it harder to recall officials later on, maybe helping the KMT avoid future recalls.
Insulating themselves, potentially.
Essentially. And finally, changes to the fiscal division law, the Tection. These seem to benefit local governments more, and, well, many of those are KMT-led.
Gotcha. Okay, I can definitely see how all that would ramp up the tension. So the DPP and civic groups start these recalls against KMT legislators. Did the KMT just take it?
Oh, no way. The KMT hit back hard. They announced a strategy of a full-scale recall effort, their target, DPP legislators. So it became this, tit-for-tat recall war across Taiwan, really escalated things.
Wow, okay, a political battle royale. Now, you mentioned a specific KMT countermeasure, this 426 Assembly. What was that about?
Right. The 426 Assembly, or 426 New, that was held on April 26. It was basically the KMT's big public rally, their main response to this whole wave of recalls targeting their own people, a way to rally their base and try to change the subject, maybe.
Interesting. Okay, so the scene is set. We have the great recall bubbling up from this legislative conflict and the KMT pushing back with this big assembly. Let's unpack this great recall a bit more. What is it really beyond just lots of recall attempts?
Fundamentally, this great recall in 2025, it's a major social and political movement. It flows directly from those legislative battles after the 2024 election, that Yoon Sess situation. It's driven by really strong disagreements about how the government should work and how laws were getting passed.
And those disputed bills were the main fuel, right? The legislative power ones, the court stuff, the recall rules.
Exactly. The DPP and these civic groups, they felt the KMT and TPP majority was just running roughshod, ignoring public opinion, maybe even undermining democratic norms. They pointed to specific tactics like locking doors for meetings, making decisions in literally 1 minute, cutting off debate time for opposition lawmakers, even weird stuff like suddenly restarting meetings after breaks.
Sounds like procedural warfare.
Yeah, the critics called it no discussion, no democracy, a real breakdown in the legislative process from their perspective.
So a deep clash over process and democratic values. And the KMT, feeling under siege from these recalls, launched their own clans against the DPP in return.
Precisely. And like we said, while there are some other recalls happening against an independent mayor, some local councilors, mostly DPP, the real heat, the main focus of this great recall, seems to be on the national legislators.
Just how widespread did it get? How many legislators were actually facing this?
It got incredibly widespread. Our sources say that as of April 25th, 2025, basically all the proposed recalls against legislators had moved to the second stage.
All of them. How many is that?
50. That's 50. 34 KMT legislators, 15 from the DPP, and 1 independent who usually votes with the KMT. Apparently, only a couple of KMT members from the smaller islands and none of the indigenous legislators had avoided a recall proposal by that point. It was almost everyone.
50 legislators in stage 2. That's staggering. Can you quickly walk us through how a recall actually works there? What are the steps?
Sure. It's basically a 3-stage process in Taiwan. Stage 1 is the proposal. You need a formal proposal, and it has to be backed by signatures from at least 1% of the voters in that specific official's district. And importantly, they have to have been in office for at least a full year before you can even start this.
Okay, 1% to get it started seems doable. What's next?
Stage 2 is the petition. This is much harder. Once the proposal is okayed, the organizers have a set time limit for national legislators. It's 60 days. In those 60 days, they need to gather signatures from at least 10% of the registered voters in the district. 10%. That's a lot of signatures to get quickly.
10% in 2 months. Yeah, that sounds like a serious organizing effort. And if they manage that.
Then you hit stage 3. The recall vote. It's like a special election just for that district. Voters get asked, basically, do you want to recall this person? For the recall to actually succeed, 2 things have to happen. First, more people have to vote yes than no, simple majority of those who vote. But second, the number of yes votes also has to be at least 25% of the total number of registered voters in that district. Not just 25% of those who showed up, but 25% of everyone eligible.
So you need both a majority of voters and a minimum turnout threshold for the yes side. That 25% rule is interesting.
Exactly. It's meant to ensure that a small, very motivated group can't just recall someone if most people don't care or disagree. It requires significant public backing. So, yeah, it's not easy.
Definitely some high bars to clear. Now, I heard these recall efforts weren't exactly smooth sailing. There were controversies.
Oh yeah, definitely not smooth. A lot of these efforts got tangled up in controversy. Big accusations about forged signatures, things called death petitions, meaning allegedly using names of people who've passed away, and ghost petitions, just completely made up names.
Wow, seriously?
Seriously. Plus complaints about improper procedures during collection, maybe even intimidation. It got pretty messy.
That sounds really problematic. Did anything come of these accusations? Investigations?
Absolutely. Law enforcement got involved. There were reports of searches at party offices, homes of organizers, and yeah, some people are reportedly detained for questioning, even charged with fraud-related offenses. Sources mention KMT party officials in Taipei and New Taipei City being detained over alleged signature fraud and recalls targeting DPP members.
So both sides facing accusations.
It seems like the signature issues were particularly highlighted in relation to efforts against DPP members, which became a problem for the KMT later. There was also that really damaging incident where a leader of a recall drive against a DPP legislator used Nazi symbols. That caused a huge public outcry, internationally too, and the KMT had to quickly distance themselves. Yeah. Stuff like that really hurts the credibility of the recall movement itself.
Yikes. Yeah, that's not good. Okay, so amidst all this mess, let's circle back to the KMT's 426 assembly. Why that specific response? A big rally focused on recalling President Lai Ching-te.
So the 426 assembly, April 26, it was the KMT's direct answer to what they saw as this unfair, politically driven recall wave against their own legislators, orchestrated, they felt, by the DPP. The whole theme was tech-deaf fight dictatorship. And the main goal they stated was to drum up support for recalling President Lai Ching-te.
So instead of just playing defense for their legislators, they went on offense against the president himself. That's quite a move.
A very aggressive move. The KMT chairman, Eric Chu, he urged the whole party to show up. They held it on Ketagalan Boulevard in Taipei, which is like the place for big political rallies in Taiwan. The strategy seems to have been mobilize the base, change the story, don't just defend against recalls, attack the ruling party and the president, paint them as the problem, as authoritarian.
Okay, this fight dictatorship rally, calling for the president's recall. What specifically did the KMT argue there? How did they justify that dictatorship label and the call to remove the president?
Well, based on the sources, the core message was exactly that, dictatorship. They framed the DPP's actions, maybe the legislative tactics, their governing style as authoritarian and bad for Taiwan's democracy. The call to recall Lai Ching-te was the action point stemming from that accusation.
Right, the fight dictatorship slogan. Sure. But were there potential downsides, blind spots in this strategy for the KMT? Could it backfire?
Yeah, potentially several blind spots. First, that whole dictatorship narrative, it might not land well with everyone. Taiwan has established democratic processes, regular elections, even these recall mechanisms we're talking about. Calling it a dictatorship might sound like hyperbole, like just partisan attacks, especially to people outside their base or international observers.
That makes sense. It's a very strong word to use in a functioning democracy. What else?
Well, focusing so much energy on recalling the president, that takes a lot of effort and attention. Meanwhile, they had, 34 of their own legislators facing recalls?
Right.
By aiming for the president, they might have been diverting resources needed to defend those legislators who were in more immediate danger. Losing those seats could weaken them significantly in the legislature, even if the presidential recall, which is incredibly difficult, went nowhere.
So maybe spreading themselves too thin, fighting on too many fronts.
Could be. And another thing, this kind of rally calling for the president's recall, it probably just ramps up the political polarization even more. Instead of maybe finding ways to talk, compromise, deal with the legislative deadlock, it just deepens the divide between the parties. Might make cooperation even harder down the line.
Yeah, more conflict probably isn't a long-term solution.
Yeah.
Any other potential issues with their approach?
Definitely. Remember those controversies about signature forging and stuff? Especially ones involving KMT officials being investigated for alleged fraud and recalls against DPP members?
Right, the scandals.
That really undermines their moral high ground when they turn around and accuse the DPP of being undemocratic or call for the president's recall. It raises questions about their own practices. That Nazi symbol incident didn't help their image either. It makes it harder for people to buy their fight dictatorship message if their own house isn't seen as being in order.
Good point. The hypocrisy charge is easy to make there. Anything else they might have missed?
One more thing, perhaps. Blaming the Great Recall only on the DPP might be too simple. Our sources suggest civic groups were really active in starting many recalls, and they seemed motivated by genuine public anger over those controversial bills and the way the KMT-TPP majority was pushing them through. So by just framing it as a DPP plot, the KMT might have been ignoring or dismissing some real grassroots frustration. And if you don't acknowledge that, your counter strategy might not connect with the broader public.
So, potentially misreading the public mood by not seeing the role of civic anger beyond just the DPP. Okay, now let's zoom out. Why should people in Taiwan really care about all this? This great recall, the KMT's assembly. What's really at stake for them?
For people in Taiwan, this whole period is hugely significant. It represents real political instability, intense partisan fighting. These actions, the recalls, the counter-recalls, they could seriously disrupt lawmaking, maybe even affect government stability. And the outcomes could reshape Taiwan's entire political landscape for years. Who holds power, what policies get passed, it all hangs in the balance.
High stakes, for sure.
Absolutely. And beyond the power struggles, those controversies around the Okkerdu recalls themselves, the forged signatures, the alleged illegal activities, they raise really serious questions about the health and integrity of Taiwan's democracy. So it's crucial for Taiwanese citizens to stay informed, to understand who's doing what and why and what the consequences might be. You know, being able to hold officials accountable, making informed choices, that's vital for any democracy.
Makes sense. And what about the rest of us around the world? Why should we pay attention to this political drama in Taiwan?
Well, what's happening in Taiwan is actually a really important case study. It shows how a democracy operates and sometimes struggles, especially in a really complex geopolitical spot. The intensity of these recalls, the allegations of fraud, they highlight challenges that many democracies face, like deep partisan divides and maintaining integrity under pressure.
Like a real-world stress test for their democratic system.
Kind of, yeah. And the world should watch because Taiwan's stability and the health of its democracy matter for the whole region, East Asia especially. Taiwan's a key democracy there. Plus, the way these narratives are being spun, accusations of dictatorship, maybe hints of outside influence, it gives us insights into information warfare, political polarization, things affecting democracies everywhere. How Taiwan gets through this period will be watched closely.
Really interesting points. Okay, so to wrap this deep dive up, what are the main takeaways from this whole Great Recall situation in Taiwan?
Okay, key points. The Great Recall of 2025 really grew out of that post-election legislative gridlock, the root C's situation. The KMT-TPP majority clashed hard with the DPP over major laws. This led the DPP and civic groups to launch recalls against KMT legislators, accusing them of overreach and undemocratic tactics. The KMT fired back with their do-your-will strategy against the DPP and, crucially, held the 426 assembly. That assembly aimed to shift the narrative, calling to fight dictatorship and recall President Lai Ching-te. But that KMT strategy has potential blind spots. The dictatorship claim might not resonate, it could divert resources, increase polarization, and it's potentially undermined by the KMT's own controversies related to recall procedures and maybe misjudging public sentiment. Ultimately, these events are a big deal for Taiwan's political future and offer lessons for observers globally about democratic challenges and resilience.
Got it. That's a great summary. And on that note, here's something for you, our listener, to think about. What is the proper role of recall mechanisms in a democracy? Are they a vital check on power, a tool for accountability? Or can they become weapons of partisan warfare, just creating instability? And maybe more importantly, how do we ensure as citizens that these processes stay fair and actually reflect public will instead of just being manipulated for political games? Definitely something worth mulling over.
Absolutely. A crucial question for any democracy dealing with this kind of political intensity.
Well, that's all we have time for in this deep dive. Thanks so much for breaking all that down for us.
My pleasure.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive. Until then, stay curious.